Hi, everybody. Today's Friday, November 14th, 2025, and our new guest, Craig Mokhiber, is here with us. He was born in 1960 and is an American former United Nations human rights official and a specialist in international human rights law, policy, and methodology. Welcome to our program, Craig.
Thanks, Nima. Nice to be with you.
So let me start, Craig, with the case of Gaza, with the case of Palestine. And we know that in the aftermath of the so-called ceasefire, Trump's ceasefire, how do you see the situation right now in Gaza? How do you see the way that I don't know if there is any sort of pressure coming from the regional countries to the United States and the foreign policy of the United States. But after all, how do you find it? How do you see the current situation in Gaza?
Well, I'm glad you said so-called ceasefire because, contrary to the very carefully scripted lies of politicians and their enablers and complicit media corporations, the genocide in Palestine has not ended. There is no ceasefire, and there is no peace process, really. Just hundreds of Palestinians in Gaza have been murdered by the Israeli regime since the so-called ceasefire was declared a month ago. Hundreds more have been horribly wounded. Hundreds of homes and other civilian structures have been destroyed by the Israeli regime during this period of the so-called ceasefire. Thousands of truckloads of food and medicine and shelter and other essentials have been blocked by the regime. And in fact, there has not been a single day since the ceasefire ruse began that Israel has ceased firing or ended its genocidal siege of Gaza. Not one single day. And still, US and Western politicians and media corporations continue to disseminate what is a destructive lie. And at the same time, I have to say, the Israeli regime's genocidal attacks and settler pogroms on the West Bank have not only continued unabated, but in fact, they have accelerated during this period. So anyone who participates in this charade of a ceasefire, so-called by Trump, at this stage is either very naive or willfully complicit in a strategy that is clearly being used by saying there's a ceasefire and there's a peace process. That's a strategy that the US and Israel are using to hide the continuing genocide, to get folks to focus elsewhere while they consolidate control of Gaza, normalize the Israeli regime, and continue to perpetrate the genocide. It's still going on. And, this is, as has been said many, many times, the first live streamed genocide in history. So we all know what is happening on the ground. We know that Israel has systematically destroyed essentially all of Gaza. It has carried out massacres and mass abductions and systematic torture and the shooting of Palestinian toddlers by snipers for sport, the destruction of all of the necessities of life, the continuing siege, all of this with the specific intent to destroy the Palestinian people, first in Gaza and ultimately all throughout historic Palestine. That did not begin in October of 2023. You merely saw an upsurge of the kind of violence that the Israeli regime has been perpetrating against Palestinians for decades. And it did not end with this declaration of a so-called ceasefire.
For us who are not that much familiar with the United Nations, and we are all the time we are criticizing how the United Nations is somehow trying to face what's going on in the Middle East, in Gaza. But what can they do, in your opinion? We have this U4P, Unity for Peace, and how is that going to help us to be used for the case of Israel and Palestine?
Well, when you talk about the United Nations, you always have to be clear on which United Nations you're talking about. A part of the United Nations has responded to this genocide very well indeed. Here I'm talking about, for example, the independent human rights mechanisms of the UN, like the Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, or the International Commission of Inquiry that has verified that genocide is happening in Palestine, other UN human rights mechanisms, humanitarian actors who've been working hard and taking great risk to deliver some relief to the Palestinian people. And of course, UNRWA, workers. Those are UN workers, hundreds of whom, just during this genocide, have been murdered by the Israeli regime, hundreds more terribly wounded, many abducted and tortured in Israeli dungeons. Those are part of the UN as well, and they have been nothing short of heroic during the genocide. But the political side of the House has failed miserably. And here I'm talking about the Secretary General, the senior political leadership of the UN, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and others, who not only have not rallied to oppose the genocide, they haven't even dared to say the name of the crime out loud. Instead, when you are asked about it, they'll say something like, well, only a court can determine genocide, which is a nonsense line invented in the hallways of the Secretariat to avoid having to say out loud that Israel is committing genocide, so that they don't take pressure then from the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Israel lobby groups that will harass them endlessly. So they just escape the discussion. And in the process, not only are they denying and abandoning the victims and survivors of the genocide in Palestine, they are abandoning the norms and standards of the organization, of the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Human Rights Treaties, the findings of the International Court of Justice, which is also a part of the UN. All of that they are dismissing so that they don't have to take criticism from the United States, the United Kingdom, the Germans, the Israel lobby, and others. They have dropped the ball miserably. Now, when you go to the intergovernmental bodies, like the Security Council that a lot of people know about, or the UN General Assembly, there it's another story. The Security Council is an archaic, old, post-World War II Cold War mechanism in which the 5 winners of World War II have veto power. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China all have veto power, which means that if any one of them don't agree to something, it's blocked in the Security Council. And that's why for 2 years of genocide, you've seen the Security Council has done absolutely nothing. It has not called for a ceasefire. It has not mobilized protection for the Palestinian civilians. It has not held Israel accountable. It has not deployed sanctions or an embargo. It has not even suspended the credentials of the Israeli regime as it murders United Nations staff. It has done absolutely nothing because the US, and frankly its allies, do everything they can to make sure that the Security Council cannot act. That leaves you with the UN General Assembly. Oh, and by the way, I should say, the US has vetoed action throughout this genocide 6 times. And beyond this genocide, it has issued vetoes 50 times, all 50 for the purpose of ensuring impunity for the Israeli regime and its crimes throughout the years. So that brings you to the General Assembly. Now, the General Assembly does have some freedom of action. It also has a global majority that supports Palestine, a supermajority. In fact, in September of 2024, when the General Assembly adopted a historic resolution, basically codifying all of the decisions of the International Court of Justice about the illegality of the Israeli occupation and the demands for Israel to stop its assaults on Gaza, all of that, and giving a 1-year deadline for Israel to comply, that was adopted by like 90% of the member states of the United Nations, against the objections of the US and Israel and a few other extreme allies of that regime. But that deadline expired in September of this year, and nothing has happened to hold Israel accountable. Why? Because Israel's friends in the UN mobilized to create a distraction to prevent Israel from being held accountable by first adopting a French-Saudi proposal called the New York Declaration now, that basically proposes the normalization of Israel even during its genocide, the deploying of a proxy occupation force to Gaza to control not the perpetrator of the genocide, but to control the victims of the genocide, and to force the Palestinians back into a situation where they have to negotiate for their rights with their oppressor, rather than to have the rights guaranteed as the International Court of Justice says they must. And then, of course, Donald Trump issued his own plan in which he basically calls for 19th century US colonization of Gaza on behalf of the Israelis, the further denial of self-determination, the further caging of the people of Gaza, the disarming of the Palestinian resistance, and the continuing normalization of the Israeli regime. And now what's happening in the UN Security Council is that diplomats that support the US and others are now negotiating to try to combine the French-Saudi proposal, which is a colonial plan, with the US proposal, which is a pure 19th century colonial plan, in order to stop all these calls for accountability of the Israeli regime and to further control the Palestinian peoples. In other words, their response to the genocide has been punish the victims and reward the perpetrator. We've never seen this in the history of the United Nations before. We hope that won't happen. Now, Nima, there is a third track that started even before all of the developments that we've seen, because, you know, for this 2 years of genocide, Israel has literally gotten away with murder. But it is also a 2-year period in which Israel is on trial for genocide in the International Court of Justice. Its leaders are indicted for crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Court. It has been found guilty of apartheid by the International Court of Justice. And it has been condemned as guilty of genocide and apartheid by every major international human rights organization, Israeli human rights organizations, Palestinian human rights organizations, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, international lawyers from around the world. There is a global consensus that Israel is perpetrating apartheid and genocide, and a demand that it be held accountable for that. And that track includes a movement to try to get the United Nations General Assembly to go around the US veto in the Security Council by using this old mechanism called Uniting for Peace. Uniting for Peace is a mechanism in the UN General Assembly. Remember, in the General Assembly, there are no P5 permanent members. There's no veto. There's 193 countries. Every country gets one vote, and there's no veto. So Uniting for Peace would allow the General Assembly, the global majority, to decide what happens without being obstructed by the US veto. And under Uniting for Peace, the General Assembly could reject Israel's credentials, call for sanctions, call for a military embargo, establish an accountability mechanism, reactivate the UN's anti-apartheid mechanisms to deal with apartheid inside Israel. And importantly, it could mandate a UN protection force to travel to Gaza, to protect Palestinian civilians from Israeli attacks, to ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid throughout Gaza, to preserve evidence of Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity, and to begin the process of reconstruction without interfering with Palestinian governance, Palestinian political rights, just making sure that civilians are protected. And it could be deployed as a consent-based mechanism based on the consent of the Palestinians, not imposed on them against their will as a proxy occupation. And that process has been going on. It's been stalled because of these other initiatives that have pushed it onto the back burner. It's also been stalled because its principal sponsor is President Gustavo Petro of Colombia. And the minute that he announced this, he came under attack from the United States, which pulled his visa, threatened him with sanctions and tariffs, threatened to even overturn his government. So he's under a great deal of pressure now from the US government for daring to stand up to genocide in Palestine. But the idea is still alive. It will be crushed, it seems to me, if the US succeeds in getting the Security Council to mandate this colonial occupation of Gaza. And then we'll be right back to where we were for the past 80 years of the occupation, dispossession, denial of self-determination, and persecution of the Palestinian people while they are forced to beg for their rights with the promise of maybe a Bantustan somewhere down the road.
How about other, within the Security Council, who wants I think the only country that doesn't want the two-state solution is the United States, or the United Kingdom and France have the same sort of position. How do you see the combination within the Security Council? We have China and Russia, both of them it seems that they recognize the two-state solution. The three Western countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, how about them, and what is their position in the aftermath or as the genocide is going on in Gaza?
Well, I mean, that's good to frame it that way, because if you look at through the lens of the genocide in Gaza, the United States is one of the P5, the permanent five members of the Security Council. We call them the P5. They have veto power. They are a co-perpetrator of the genocide in Palestine. They're not just, contributing to it. They're actually enthusiastically, under both the Democratic administration and a Republican administration, participating in that genocide. They provide most of the weapons and the money and the diplomatic cover and the intelligence and the dissemination of genocide propaganda on behalf of the Israeli regime. All of that comes from the United States government, which enthusiastically participates in the genocide. So they are a co-perpetrator. That's one of the P5. Then you have the British and the French. They have been complicit in the genocide. And complicity in genocide is a specific crime under international law codified by the Genocide Convention. It's a crime in its own right. And both the UK and France have been using their resources, their power, their military capacities, their weapons that they produce, their intelligence, their diplomatic role to support Israel in the perpetration of genocide. They are complicit in the genocide, so they don't want accountability for the genocide, because that accountability would also extend to them. Then you have Russia and China. Russia has a very interesting profile because it has very close relationships with Israel, but it also aligns itself often with the global South, which are aligned with Palestine for the most part. And China, similarly, is very much aligned with the G77, the global South. And both Russia and China are concerned about what the state of Palestine, the representatives of the state of Palestine, want here. So the role that they're playing in the Security Council now is they are insisting in the Security Council that whatever resolution is adopted, is what the Palestinian state of Palestine want, that it doesn't impose a colonial U.S. occupation on the Gaza Strip. This Donald Trump's plan includes something they call the Board of Peace, which is a colonial mechanism headed by Donald Trump himself, together with Tony Blair, famous for his war crimes in Iraq, that would dominate the people of Gaza. And China and Russia is saying, no, if you want to send a stabilization force, we might be able to support that, but we're not going to support that piece of it. Now, will they stand firm? We hope. We hope that they would veto any attempt to get, because what Trump is trying to do, and the French and and others, the UK, they're trying to put a stamp of approval from the UN, effectively to legalize what is an unlawful colonial grab in Gaza, what is an unlawful denial of international law by punishing the victims of a genocide and rewarding the perpetrators of a genocide. If they can get the Security Council to put a UN stamp on it, then they feel that they have legitimized their criminal enterprise. So the hope is that Russia and China will stand firm and not allow this to happen. Now, Trump may go ahead anyway and just do it through force of arms, which is his modus operandi, but at least it will not have been legitimized with the UN stamp. I believe that if the UN Security Council allows this resolution to go through and gives a UN stamp of approval to the further colonization and oppression of the Palestinian people, that will be the last nail in the legitimacy of UN, of the United Nations. And that would be, I think, a very high price to bear. So we hope it won't happen. Now, if there is a veto, that provides an opportunity in the General Assembly to do what I spoke about earlier, to convene under Uniting for Peace mechanism and adopt a real protection force for Palestinian civilians and real measures of accountability for the Israeli regime.
Israel came to existence because of the United Nations. They voted, for the state of Israel. But how is there any talk in UN, discussing what's going on with the state of Israel, which the only country on Earth, on planet, with no borders? What does that mean? What does that? Because whenever we talk about two-state solution, so you have to consider what are the borders of Israel, Because right now, look at the West Bank. As you've mentioned, the situation in the West Bank is not much better than Gaza. And they have captured, looking at the map, you see some points on the map shows that this is the West Bank. This is not the West Bank. The settlers just occupied all the West Bank. How can someone argue two-state solution? Because when we go with the two-state solution, we have to understand the concept behind it. Is that possible, in your opinion, when we talk about two-state solution and with the current situation of Israel not defining its borders? They're in Syria, in southern part of Syria, they're capturing, they're going beyond the Golan Heights. I would assume as soon as they get, everything done with Lebanon, with Syria, they're going to go to Jordan. So what is that? What is the end game, in your opinion? And how can be, how the countries in the region can understand better the situation with Israel?
Well, the end game is what is called the Greater Israel Project by Zionist thinkers, which is, the Nile to the Euphrates, to repeat the term that's been used throughout history. Israel already, let's start with the partition plan that you mentioned. First of all, the United Nations General Assembly has no authority to partition a country against the will of its inhabitants. And in 1947, when they issued a partition plan for Palestine, as it was called then, it was rejected by the indigenous people, by the Palestinians. It was accepted by the leadership of the colonizers, not surprisingly, because they had moved for this to happen. But even that illegal partition of Palestine in 1947 did not include what people refer to as Israel today. It was a much smaller distribution of the land. It was already unfair because it gave most of the land to the minority, which were the colonists, and it took away most of the land from the indigenous people, which were the Palestinians. But even then, you're talking about a much smaller defined state for Israel than what came to be. In 1947 and 1948, the Nakba, the catastrophe, the first major genocide of the Palestinian people by the Israelis, they used that to expand their control of territory all the way up to what are the 1967 borders that we understand today. So the first grant of land to them through UN partition was unlawful. They then used force to try to take more land in 1947 and 1948. And remember, the acquisition of territory by force is a violation of not only of international law, but of so-called, excuse these terms, jus cogens and erga omnes rules, which means the highest unbreakable rules of international law. You cannot acquire territory by force. That's how Israel acquired much more of the land going up to the 1967 borders. And of course, in 1967, they then took the rest of Palestine by occupying the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So it's been expanded that far. And right now, de facto, there is one state. There is one regime that rules all of historic Palestine from the Mediterranean to the Jordan, and that's the Israeli regime. And they have created a situation in which a two-state solution is impossible, what they call creating facts on the ground. That while everybody's negotiating and talking about law, we're just going to create a reality on the ground that is irreversible. So now if you look at a map of the West Bank, you will see that Israel controls most of the West Bank. And there are little spots of Palestinian communities surrounded by giant settlements of Israeli colonists that might be available for some Bantustans, somewhere down the road, but not a state. So, and Gaza, of course, is entirely controlled and occupied by the Israelis. It was even before the genocide spiked in October of 2023, and it certainly is now, including with boots on the ground all over Gaza. So that's not there. Then so we've gone from zero with an unlawful partition plan to a grant of land that was expanded then in 1948, in 1967, and it also includes, as you say, the occupation of territory in Syria, not just the Syrian Golan, but all the way almost to the capital of Damascus, the occupation of territory in the south of Lebanon. And while it doesn't occupy in the strict sense other parts of the Middle East, it has routinely exercise military force against them so that it dominates those places. So, Israel has perpetrated acts of aggression against Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and Iran and Yemen, just, serial acts of aggression, just bombing at will. It doesn't even make the news anymore. They bomb these countries so frequently. So there it has expanded its dominion even further across Western Asia, and I would argue it has also expanded even beyond Western Asia. I live in the United States, and here, at the behest of this one oppressive foreign regime of Israel, my own government oppresses people in this country who dare to criticize the Israeli regime. And we've seen the same thing in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in the Netherlands, across the Western world. So, yeah, the project of Greater Israel is something that the sort of extreme ideology, the state ideology of Zionism inside of Israel and its supporters abroad have worked hard to bring about, and they are celebrating now that they have the U.S. empire on their side to make this come about, and nothing seems to be standing in their way, including many of the governments of the region that simply defer to Washington and to Israel on any of these abuses as they take place. So there is nothing left for a two-state solution. I have always argued that the only viable solution, and it's interesting, in the UN and in Western governments, they will repeat over and over again this mantra: there is no alternative to a two-state solution. Well, that's a lie on many levels. There could be a one-state, two-state, three-state, four-state. So even logically, it doesn't make sense. There's no land left for a two-state solution in the West Bank and Gaza that would be sustainable and adequate. And by the way, even if you had a two-state solution of some kind, it would not answer the rights of Palestinians from inside the Green Line, from inside what is now called Israel, who have a right to return to the homes that were stolen from them, who have a right to compensation, and who have a right to live there as equal citizens, which is impossible under a Zionist regime, which is an ethno-supremacist regime, and can never afford equal rights to Palestinians, to the indigenous people.
Yeah. How do you see the role of the domestic, the countries, Muslim countries, all together? I'm talking about the Arab states together, Turkey, Iran, and what do they have? Do they have any sort of leverage on what's going on internationally with the case of Israel and Gaza and Palestine?
Well, they could have leverage if they acted in a principled way. The problem is that for all of the rhetorical support that the Muslim and Arab countries have given to the Palestinian people, many of them have not even ceased their cooperation with the Israeli regime. And as a matter of fact, the International Court of Justice has ruled that they must. And yet they continue to provide things that support Israel's genocide, Israel's occupation, Israel's apartheid, everything from fuel to machine parts to parts for weapons to technologies to you name it, and to purchase things from the regime, boosting its economy as a result of that. So, and even some countries in the region have even cooperated with the United States and Israel in Israel's defense during the genocide, when other states have sought to intervene to hold Israel accountable or to draw it away from its genocidal activities in Gaza. So there's a lot of rhetorical support. You will see a lot of these countries are more than happy to sign on to these nefarious plans of the United States and the French. And the French proposal is called the French-Saudi proposal because it was chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, and it is just pure colonialism. It is a pure denial of not only the suffering of the Palestinian people, but their rights as codified in international law. So, I mean, I would say to those countries, yes, by all means, continue your rhetorical support, vote with Palestine in the United Nations and so on, but it means nothing if you continue to provide material support to the state of Israel as it perpetrates all of these crimes. There should be by now universal boycott of the Israeli economy and of Israeli culture and sports. There should be now a universal military embargo against the Israelis. The regime needs to be isolated the way that the South African regime was isolated under apartheid. The world came together, led by the global South, to make sure that that regime was isolated and would not be able to continue its colonization. And they did not abandon that in the name of a two-state solution, even though the South African regime offered Bantustans for Black South Africans. Nobody said, okay, it's a two-state solution, that's the only solution. They held fast to the principle of African liberation and freedom and equality for everyone who lives there until apartheid fell. And the same thing could be done if, beginning with the Muslim and Arab countries and then expanding to the global South and beyond, you could have solidarity in the United Nations to isolate this regime, to impose sanctions on it, a military embargo, to remove it from the General Assembly of the United Nations by refusing its credentials, by organizing against the apartheid and abuses of the regime. That global solidarity could change history. And we saw that in the 1960s and 70s, when new members of the global South, recently decolonized, joined the United Nations and used the United Nations as a tool of decolonization, as a tool of self-determination, and anti-colonialism and anti-apartheid action. The same thing could happen now if we had principled leadership in Muslim and Arab countries around the world.
Many people believe, who are living outside of the United States, maybe inside the United States, that your country is the most powerful country on earth to put pressure on Israel, and they can do it. And do you feel that there is something going on in the United States that may influence the foreign policy of the United States in Israel, in the Middle East?
Well, first, it's true that the US has the most powerful military in the world and has so far the most powerful economy in the world. But if you're looking at the big picture, you will realize that the unipolar US empire moment is fading, that was not something that was going to be sustained in the long term. And I think many of these sort of violent contractions you see coming out of the United States are precisely because the empire is beginning to unravel. And you see the evolution of a multipolar world. You see moves to de-dollarize and to obtain economic independence from the dominance of the United States. You see groups with independent foreign policy, like the Hague Group. You see the BRICS coming up, the Shanghai Cooperation Forum. So that unipolar moment of the U.S. empire, that's beginning to come unraveled. Still, the U.S. is the most powerful. It spends $1 trillion a year on its military, and it sends billions to Israel to maintain its impunity in Western Asia. So it still is a force to be reckoned with. And when people say that the U.S. could put pressure on Israel, yes, it could, but it won't. It will never put meaningful, because the U.S., for all of the talk about democracy, is an oligarchy. It is a country that is ruled by very wealthy, powerful interests. And if you look at the policies adopted by the country, by the way, especially foreign policy, but also domestic policy, on the one hand, and what the people of the country want versus what these oligarchs and corporations and billionaires and lobbies want, you can see very clearly who the government belongs to in the United States, and it's not the people. Most people in the United States are appalled by the Israeli regime and want to defend the Palestinian people. And that is beginning to change internal political dynamics in this country for the first time in a long time, because, in the two political parties, you now have a majority of so-called Democrats who want Israel to be held accountable and want the Palestinians to be defended. And you even have a growing minority of Republicans. And remember, the Republicans in the US are a very far-right, extreme far-right party. But even a growing minority of Republicans who are insisting on the same thing. That is a very fundamental change. And I think that came because it's not just the Israelis, because in the US government, you have people who are absolutely committed to the Israeli regime, even above their own country. People who take that feeling out of evangelical Christian Zionist reasons. People because they are Zionists, people because they are neoconservative imperialists who see Israel as playing an important role in that approach to the rest of the world. People who make a lot of money from the military and technological relationship between the United States and Israel. And these are people who are in government, in industry, in the ruling class of the United States, who are committed to the continuation of the Israeli regime as it is. So you're not going to get a US government, Democrat or Republican, anytime soon that's going to view Israel as an adversary that needs to be controlled or reined in. Maybe here and there, don't when you're committing your genocide, slow it down a little bit. You don't have to stop it, but anything more than that significant is not going to happen. But in the long term, if the trajectory continues, changes in domestic politics in the U.S., I think you will begin to see some of those kinds of changes. We are not there yet, but I think in the long term it will happen. I'll say one more thing about that, Nima. Because Israel proxies in this country have realized, including billionaires and pro-Israel corporations and some of the oligarchs and people in government, because they've realized that they can no longer control the narrative in the United States, because people don't rely on CNN and Fox News and CBS, all of these, the New York Times, all of these pro-Israel outlets. They don't rely on them for information anymore. They now can get it from alternative media, from social media, from shows like yours. They can have it directly streamed to their phones on social media and know exactly what's happening. They can no longer, the Israeli machine can no longer control the narrative in the United States. And so people seeing with their own eyes have said, wait a minute, this is not something that I support. So what they're doing now, instead of trying to convince people, is they're trying to use force. They're silencing people. They're criminalizing people who speak out against the genocide. They call them supporters of terrorism and anti-Semites, and then they take legal action against them. They're deporting people. They're sicking the police on students protesting against a genocide. They're expelling and suspending and arresting and deporting and beating people for speaking out against it. They are trying to pass laws to prohibit boycott, divestment, and sanctions, even though it's guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. They are buying up media companies to try to make sure that they can even, social media companies like TikTok being taken over by Israel proxies and so on. So they're trying to use force now in ways that they didn't have to in the past. And that is a sign of brutality, to be sure. And some people will be intimidated by it. But especially it's a sign that they're losing, and they know they're losing, and the world is changing.
We have two, in my opinion, powerful movements in the United States. One on the on the left, which the progressive, those people who usually vote for Democrats in the United States, they have decided to withdraw from the Democratic Party. They wanted something else to vote for. But the other growing voice in the United States is within the MAGA, within the Republican Party. Those people who we were not that much familiar with these people. They were not that much vocal about what's going on specifically in the Middle East and in the case of Israel. How do you see these two forces coming together, or maybe because when it comes to the foreign policy and these sort of support that goes from the United States to Israel, these people can come together. Don't you think that would hugely influence the the political system of the United States, which simply is two parties, Republican, Democrats? And look at what has happened with the Trump administration. Donald Trump is not a Republican. He's an outsider. He came out, that watershed moment in his career was the way that he was talking about the war in Iraq. And I was against the war in Iraq. That was totally. And you see the new phenomenon in New York with the Mamdani. He was the only candidate who didn't they were asked, the candidates were asked, where are you gonna go the day after you've been elected in as the mayor of New York? He was the only candidate that said, I'm gonna stay in New York. People understand these sort of arguments. That's why they're getting the votes, because they see something different, an alternative to what is happening, to their status quo. And how is that going to, all these together, how is that going to influence the future of the political system of the United States, which is important, in my opinion, to the case of Palestinians?
Yeah, I think that's already happening. So, yeah, and Mamdani, for example, I mean, that's very interesting. New York City is the center of support for Israel on the planet in many respects. Traditionally, it's also the home of Wall Street. It is also the home of the most powerful real estate lobby, probably just about anywhere. It also is a place where the Israel lobby is deeply rooted in New York City. It's also a home of a disproportionate number of billionaires connected to the oligarch class who support Israel. And yet, Zoran Mamdani won the mayoral election with the highest turnout in recent history, not despite his outspokenness about Palestine and Israel, but in measure because of it, because people, some significant number of the public are just horrified by what Israel is and what Israel does. Another significant bunch of the public is disgusted by Israeli control of US politicians and US political processes. And they thought this is really refreshing. This guy is being elected the mayor of New York. They're trying to force him to say that he will focus on this foreign regime. And he's saying, no, my job is to focus on New York. This is where I'm going to be. I'm not going to go visit Israel. Or they tried to force him to endorse an ethno-nationalist state in Israel. And he said, no, I believe in a state with equal rights for everybody. And people said, well, you can't win an election in the US. Not only did he win, he won in part because of that, and in New York City, of all of the places on earth, because that's what the people wanted, and by a significant margin against one of the most prominent Democrats from a prominent Democratic family in New York City. And you're right that there is a convergence between the left and the right in the United States increasingly. As I said, the Democratic Party is now a significant majority in favor of the Palestinian cause and opposed to the Israeli project. But increasingly, not only in the Republican Party, but in the MAGA movement, Donald Trump's MAGA movement, you have leading figures like Tucker Carlson and Dave Smith and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Candace Owens. These are like the opinion makers of the MAGA movement, who, both for pure moral reasons, that they are horrified by what Israel is and what Israel does, and they say, why are you telling me that we have to support this horror when this offends all of my personal values? And for political reasons, which is they are a part of a movement called America First, which they say means that they want the politics of the US, the government of the US, the money of the US to focus first on the American people. Why are we sending $6 billion a year and spending all of our political capital and compromising everything in the interest of the American people on behalf of this oppressive foreign regime called Israel? That's not America first, that's Israel first. They are disgusted by seeing politicians bowing down to a foreign regime rather than acting either on principle or at the very least just on the interest of their own people that they are elected to serve. So for all of these reasons, you are seeing increasingly some of the most prominent voices on the right in the US agreeing with the most prominent voices on the left in the US that this policy has got to change. And I think a big part of it is people are offended by the capture of American politics and American institutions by the Israel lobby and by its associated billionaires and corporations that work very hard to make sure that this government serves not the interest of the American people, but the interest of the small, oppressive foreign regime called Israel. And left and right, people are very sick of that.
Craig, the United States when Donald Trump came to power, was elected in the United States, they said that we're going to go to the Red Sea. We're going to hit Houthis, Yemenis, the way that the Biden administration wasn't able to do. And this time around, going to be different. We're going to show them. They went to the Red Sea. They couldn't do anything. And As Donald Trump said, they capitulated, Houthis capitulated at that. But the United States has decided that they cannot do anything in the Red Sea, that let's get back. And with the war between Iran and Israel, Israel really sees Iran as the backbone of the resistance, because they see the missiles of Iran going to Yemen, they're supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the governments in Syria before the fall of Assad was supported by Iran. And they thought that if they go in Iran and do regime change in Iran, that would hugely collapse the whole resistance that that could help them with the case of Palestinians and the greater Israel, as you've mentioned. But none of those plans were working so far for Israel. And I don't know how long the United States want to support Israel in the region. Do you see any sort of benefit out of this support that goes to Israel for such a long time? You know, we had the former president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, calling the state of Israel apartheid. And it's not that much strange to call Israel an apartheid regime. They understand it. The political elite in the United States, they understand the reality of Israel. And how do you think that it's all about the oligarchs deciding about these policies without the United States benefiting really from what's going on in the Middle East?
I do. I think that if you look at U.S. foreign policy in particular, U.S. policy more generally, including domestic, but especially U.S. foreign policy, you will see that it is often behaving in a way that is not in the interest of the people of the United States. It is often in the interest of the oligarchs, because war and conquest is big business. It is big business, obviously, for the weapons manufacturers, for energy companies, but especially these days for tech companies. Silicon Valley is as much a part of this as the Beltway bandit companies around Washington that work for the defense industry, and the Wall Street robber barons in New York as well. They're as much a part of this because their own personal interests and wealth are very much tied up with a belligerent position of the United States. How does it make sense that the U.S. Serves in a very servile way the Israeli regime, costing them potentially better relationships with the entire Arab and Muslim world? And there's a qualification on that, because many of those governments in the Arab world are just subservient regimes that are client states of the United States, and that follow its orders with regard to Israel, ultimately, whatever rhetoric they put out there. Of course, the exception to that is Iran, and the exception to that is Ansar Allah, Yemen, and the exception to that is Hezbollah in Lebanon. In the entire region, it is only those three forces that have actually taken personal risks, personal investment, put themselves at risk, spent their own investment, and engaged in a material way to oppose the genocide as it was happening in Gaza. Not Egypt, not Jordan, not Iraq, not Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or anyone else, or Morocco. Many of these states are in bed with the U.S. empire and with the Israelis. But it was those countries only. And, every one of them made a serious impact on this. So, for example, you mentioned the Houthis, Ansar Allah in Yemen. Their blockade in the Red Sea bankrupted the Israeli port of Eilat, literally bankrupted it, stopped supplies from flowing in to support the genocidal regime during the perpetration of genocide. Now, I have written that in doing so, they were actually conforming with the requirements of international law, that all states are obliged affirmatively to act where they have power to try to stop a genocide from happening. So what they were doing was perfectly just and I believe lawful when they were doing that. They were mercilessly bombed for that by the United States and the UK, with the complicity of some of the neighbors in the region. But that merciless bombing did not make them surrender. They remained steadfast. Yes, they made a deal, but that deal was about U.S. shipping. It wasn't about the Israelis. So they remained steadfast, and the same thing with Iran. I think I don't think it's over. I think Israel and the U.S. are continuing to plan for the next strikes on Iran. I think they continue to harbor a dream of regime change, a dream that will turn into a nightmare very quickly for them. There is no doubt in my mind this is not something that is going to succeed, and it's not going to be a cakewalk, which was proven in the last round, where it was the Israelis who were looking for a ceasefire ultimately because they cannot sustain a protracted conflict. They are used to fighting wars on other people's territory by doing it by attacking civilians in order to get people to yield. They're not used to a back and forth with another military power that also includes a battlefield on their own territory. And so it's not something that they could sustain. So they're hoping for a bigger investment from the U.S. next time around. That would allow them to cause more massive destruction in Iran on behalf of the Israeli regime. Remember, this is an Israeli dream that Netanyahu and his colleagues have been pushing for decades, to try to pull the U.S. into a war with Iran because they know they can't beat Iran on their own. But I don't think they are going to succeed. I think, to the contrary, they are going to open a hornet's nest that they will ultimately come to regret. But yeah, to answer your question, there are a lot of interest in the United States that would be more than happy to see another Iran that profited hugely from U.S. aggression in Vietnam, U.S. aggression in Iraq, U.S. aggression in Syria, U.S. aggression in Libya. I mean, this is their bread and butter. They are literally merchants of death. And that is a business that has always been very, very profitable. And now with the tech piece of all of that, it's become even more profitable. And we have a government in this country that serves them, not us, not the voices for peace. And by the way, we have a complicit set of media corporations that also are tied both financially and ideologically to the cause of war in Western Asia, who will just make sure, as they did with Iraq, they will manufacture consent for aggression and even genocide, because it is, in their minds, it is in their interest to do so.
Before wrapping up, Craig, how do you see the way that, is it possible to change the structure of UN Security Council? Adding India, maybe some other countries that are important, to just make some sort of balance. You've mentioned, the United Kingdom, the United States, and France in favor of Israel. So what about other countries? We have, as you've mentioned, the General Assembly, all of these countries together. But how about the structure of the UN Security Council, which is much important to my understanding when it comes to these issues with the wars?
Yeah.
How do you see that?
Well, first, that's absolutely correct. If you look at the, there's an old movie called The Godfather, and lots of mafia movies that always talk about the heads of the 5 families in New York. That was a part of the ruling structure of the mafia. That's the Security Council. The heads of the 5 families are the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. You will notice that includes nobody from the Arab world. It includes nobody from Latin America. It includes nobody from the entire African continent, right? It includes the victors of World War II alone. That is not a mechanism that can, as the charter says, maintain international peace and security. Quite the contrary. You take the United States, for example. In the eyes of most people in the world, the United States is the biggest threat to international peace and security, given its aggressive foreign policy, its use of not just war, but covert operations and coup d'etat, and regime change and aggression, after aggression since World War II. And yet it sits on this as one of the heads of the 5 families with veto power in the Security Council. You can reform the Security Council by adding other members to the council. And indeed, that should be done to have a more representative council. But the only thing that would change the fundamental problems of the Security Council would be to change the permanent members with veto power. So some of the proposals are we'll add more members, more temporary members. Other proposals will add more members to the permanent members, but we won't give them veto power. Well, that's not going to solve your problem. Your problem is that there are 5 countries that have disproportionate power, including the veto. So, and here's the challenge. The challenge is that cannot be changed under the rules of the UN unless the P5 agree, all of the P5 agree. And they will not agree. They're not going to give up this trump card that they have in geopolitics. So what do you do then? Well, what you do is you go around the Security Council. The General Assembly is supposed to be the democratic, let's say, legislative body of the United Nations. And people say, well, yeah, but the General Assembly doesn't have Chapter 7 enforcement power and so on. That's true. But let's look at what that means in practice. It means that it cannot enforce sanctions, for example, but it can call sanctions. And the minute it does so, those become multilateral sanctions on which all countries can sign on and implement individually and collectively. So you can't force if Micronesia or Bulgaria say, well, we're not going to do the sanctions, fine. But if you can get most countries to do so, those sanctions can have the impact that you want them to have, for example, against Israel. So they don't need enforcement power to call sanctions. They don't need enforcement power to call a military embargo. They don't need, kicking a country out of the UN, especially a country like Israel, which has violated every UN precept and countless UN resolutions of the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, the Economic and Social Council, you name it, that has declared the Secretary General persona non grata, that has attacked UN compounds and UN convoys, that has murdered hundreds of UN staff, that has abducted and tortured many UN staff. And they're still walking around the UN with UN credentials because the US will not allow them in the Security Council to be removed from the UN. So what do? You go to the General Assembly, as we learned during apartheid South Africa, where the General Assembly just created a way to deal with this. They said, we are not recognizing accepting the credentials of the state of apartheid South Africa. They could do the same thing in the state of Israel and effectively help to isolate the regime and bring real pressure to bear for change on that basis. The General Assembly during the 1960s and 70s played a very important role, as I've said, in the anti-colonial struggles, in the anti-apartheid struggle, for example, because the Global South, as the new majority, unified to use their collective power for development, peace and security, human rights, decolonization, self-determination, the values of the UN Charter, the values of the UN's human rights instruments. That's how that happened. And all of that was brushed aside with the unipolar moment that came after the implosion of the Soviet Union, where the US had this unparalleled power geopolitically over the rest of the world. And suddenly all of that was pushed back into the background, and the Security Council was put forward as the only option. It's not the only option. And even now, the General Assembly could adopt a resolution under Uniting for Peace to mandate a protection force for Palestine and to impose a military embargo and sanctions and the denial of Israel's credentials and establish an accountability mechanism and reactivate the anti-apartheid mechanisms. All of that could happen in the General Assembly. We don't need the Security Council to do that. And I think that going forward, that's what should happen. The global majority should assert its power, get up off its knees before the US empire, and start having some self-respect and self-determination, and come together for the purposes and principles of the Charter, and to stop this imperial domination of geopolitics by one country that is driven by pecuniary, military, and economic interests that are not in the interest of peace and security, development, or human rights.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Craig, for being with us today. It was a great pleasure to have you on.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Nima. I appreciate the conversation.
Have a great time, Joe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.